hopefully get himself back in here. That's too bad.
He said he was going to reboot his computer, I think, so that'll take a few more minutes.
Trish, maybe while he's doing that, I could provide a little bit of Paul's background for the group.
Excellent.
Okay. So, hi everyone, Julie Stackhouse here, and I know Paul well because I'm on the Fort Collins Planning and Zoning Commission. So got to meet a lot of great people at the city of Fort Collins, but a little bit about his background. Paul title is Director of Community Development and Neighborhood Services. So in Fort Collins, that's quite a bit. That's planning and development, building services, historic preservation, neighbor services, and customer administrative services. As you can imagine, he has had his fingers in a lot of the work done on the effort to update the Fort Collins Land Use Code to be something that's a little bit, in my view, a little bit more in line with the growing and changing needs of Fort Collins. And it's been quite a journey, and he's going to cover some of that for us today. In other things he's done, he's been a planner in Grand Junction some years ago. He was with the city of Longmont for a period of time, and he did his education his graduate education at the University of Central Florida, where he has a master's in public administration and a graduate certificate in urban and regional planning. Hopefully Paul will be back on here in a minute. Oh, and I see him. I don't know if he can hear me as I chat him up. He's smiling, so I think he can hear me. Can you hear me, Paul?
I was able to hear your very gracious introduction. So,
okay. Well, now comes the really good part. One thing that I've observed with the city of Fort Collins staff overall is the professionalism. You might know the city of Fort Collins won the Baldrige Award some years ago, which is not easy to do in any entity, but particularly a city government. But the professionalism with which the staff conducts itself is really amazing. And I have to say, there are times on planning and zoning where I am not so appreciative of the public. And I hopefully don't let my face show up too much, but the city staff absolutely respect everyone. And that's just been such a great attribute to everyone at the city. And I think you'll find that from Paul today. So with that brief introduction, if it's okay with the group, I'll turn it over to Paul.
Yes.
great. Yeah, thank you very much for the gracious introduction, Julie. I appreciate it. If I could just confirm, does everybody see the full slide screen the way that it seems like it should be?
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. So yeah, as Julie said, my name is Paul Sizemore. I'm the Community Development and Neighborhood Services Director for the City of Fort Collins. And today I'm here to talk with you all about the Fort Collins Land Use Code housing updates. So I've been living in Fort Collins and working for the city for the past 10 years. I've raised my 3 kids here. So Fort Collins is a really special place to me, and I've got to know it pretty well. So during the land use code update process, a member of the public was giving testimony and called the proposed code a love letter to the community. And I thought that just beautifully captured what we're trying to accomplish here. The people who are involved in the work are really committed, and they love Fort Collins deeply, and they want everyone who lives here to have that same high quality of life. I also know that anytime that we talk about change or density or growth, that these can be really divisive topics, and people have different perspectives on them. And so what I can say is that as divided as opinions can be, I know that everyone who's engaging in this work in Fort Collins is really doing it because they love the community so much. And that includes people who are in favor of change and also people who are against it. So that's the attitude that I hope I bring to this presentation today and to our conversation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of our land use code, where it came from and what was in it. What our process looked like for updating the land use code and bringing forward a proposed land development code, what was in that document. I'll talk a little bit later about the referendum petition, which was the process we went through whereby the code was ultimately repealed. I'm going to talk about what we're doing now, and then a few moments about what we've learned from this whole process. So our land use code as it exists now came out of kind of a watershed moment for Fort Collins back in 1997. And that's when we adopted our new city plan, which was our comprehensive plan based on principles of new urbanism and really enduring timeless community design standards. And at that same time, we adopted a new land use code. So it's been with us since 1997. And over those 26 years now, it's been amended incrementally in piecemeal style. And we affectionately call it a Franken code at this piece, because every year you just make little tweaks and changes, but you never overhaul it. Meanwhile, the policy environment that our land use code operates in has changed quite a bit. Back in 2011, we did an update to the city plan, and then there was a complete redo that occurred in 2019. And so that was really the impetus for moving forward with this action item to update our land use code and modernize it. And so in 2020, we did an audit of the existing land use code and all the things that were going to need to be done to realign it with our city plan. And through that process, two really distinct phases emerged. One would be focused on housing and reorganizing the code, and then the other would capture everything else, all the non-residential components. It would come later. And so with City Council's direction in 2021, we launched phase one of the code update to focus on our housing changes. That went through an extensive process that I'll dig into a little bit more. And then in November of 2022, what we called the Land Development Code was adopted by City Council. So I made reference to this petition process that we went through, and I'll explain that a little bit more. But a group of citizens came together and collected signatures that required City Council to take action on this adopted ordinance. And they could either refer it to the ballot for the voters to vote on, or they could repeal it. And Council chose in January of this year, or of I should say 2023, to repeal the Land Development Code. And so now here we are in March, and we have been back to council and have direction, and what we're unofficially calling phase 1.5 of the land use code is well underway, and I'll talk about what that process looks like. Before I dive into the process we used to write the Land Development Code and what was in it, I want to touch briefly on why housing, on why we started here and why it's so important. And I recognize that with this group, I'm probably preaching to the choir, but it's important to understand the city's motivation for doing this work. And it really comes from just a baseline understanding that in Fort Collins, as in many other places, there is a housing crisis right now. And it's very much centered on equity, that people, especially our most marginalized community members, are being pushed out of the community. And the people who stay are really subject to what amounts to a public health crisis as well, because we know in our work that the social determinants of health, including things like housing, ultimately account for 50 to 60% of health outcomes. And so people who stay but are committing too much of their income to be able to live in the community are having to make sacrifices. And that might be preventative care, it might be healthy food, and it has an impact citywide. Land use regulations play a role in this, a really key role. In Fort Collins, about 1/3 of our total land area. So if you take all the private land, the public land, the rights of way, everything, 1/3 of that space is under zoning that allows really just single family detached dwelling units. And so that results in a very large quantity of land that's set aside for a housing pattern that consumes a lot of land per unit, and also tends to be the least affordable option for many people. That also leaves limited zones for what we call missing middle housing, which is duplexes, triplexes, townhomes, because those aren't allowed in these single family zones. And where they are allowed, that tends to also be the zones that allow apartment style buildings. And so they kind of get squeezed out. We don't have a whole lot of those missing middle options. We've also got outdated and ineffective affordable housing incentives built into the code. And all of these things were really captured in our 2021 housing strategic plan. And that's where this graphic that's on your screen came from. It identifies key outcomes and then gives us direction to move forward and try to accomplish these different things. So why was the land use code updated? It really was to align with all of these different policy documents that have come along since the original land use code was adopted back in 1997. So across all of these planning efforts, more than 5 years of community engagement has built the foundation for the work, starting with the adoption of City Plan and the Transit Master Plan in 2019. They gave guidance on future land use. They mapped out the city's future transit network, and they included policies that encourage infill and redevelopment, along with more housing choices and increased high-frequency transit service. Both the Housing Strategic Plan and the Our Climate Future Plan also emphasize the need for adjustments to the way that Fort Collins regulates land use and development. Those plans were very much centered in equity and really encouraged an increase in housing supply, improved affordability, more housing choice, and transit supportive development patterns. In particular, the Housing Strategic Plan set out a vision where Fort Collins is a place where we have healthy, stable housing that everyone can afford. So in the development of the Land Development Code, we early in the process established 5 guiding principles. And these were the principles that were supported by council back in November of 2021, based on all of those existing policy documents and a really in-depth diagnostic report. The Land Development Code was designed to accomplish one or more of these principles. So there was nothing in the proposed code that didn't directly address one of these 5 guiding principles. And they are to increase housing capacity, enable more affordability, allow for more housing choices, to make the code easier to use, and to improve predictability for all the users of the code. Throughout all of these principles, they really emphasize using an equity lens to make sure that proposed changes are designed to improve housing opportunities for everybody, especially people in our community who don't have healthy, stable housing that they can afford. So you'll notice I'm going to walk through this next section in a Q&A format to guide us through the content of the Land Development Code regulations. And this is the way that we approached an information session that we did when the code was adopted, and we're reacting to lots of questions that we had. So this kind of funnel is a pretty important image because it shows the different steps of the process that led to the development of the actual code language that was in the Land Development Code, starting at that very high end, the policy level, the code audit, establishing priorities and guiding principles, all the way through the detailed diagnostic of looking at the code language itself and then coming up with the draft revisions. And like most planning processes, the net was cast very, very wide at that policy level when we were developing the plans, and it tends to get a little bit narrower. We still did lots of engagement, but in retrospect, we definitely put more emphasis in the phases of the plans that have that really big policy impact at the beginning. Thousands of individual community members were engaged across those major plan documents. And then we got the policy direction that put us into a 15-month process from July 2021 until October 2022, where we were actually doing the code writing. We had throughout just that 15-month section, 4 educational information sessions in fall of 2021, and then 4 community input sessions that came after the diagnostic report was completed. We held public workshops after the draft code was released in June of 2022, and had weekly office hours where staff were available to answer questions or talk things through over a 2-month period. We had a technical advisory group throughout the entire process that helped to advise on the development of the language. And then, as you can imagine, with a big code rewrite like this, we had a lot of work sessions and briefings with both city council, boards and commissions, and community groups along the way. So now getting into the meat of what was in this Land Development Code that we brought forward to City Council. And I'll start just by talking about what would have changed if the code had gone into effect. At a high level, the code very much expanded affordable housing incentives and requirements. It also created a menu of building types and form standards for compatibility in building design. And so it was a transition from a very text-based code to what we call a form-based code that focuses more on the way that buildings are going to be developed and interact with the built environment around them. It did allow accessory dwelling units in all residential and mixed-use zones, and these are smaller dwelling units that are ancillary to a primary dwelling unit and have size caps associated with them. They're typically called things like mother-in-law suites or carriage houses, lots of different terms for them. Throughout, there was a lot of focus on trying to encourage these missing middle housing types that I was talking about earlier. It included an expedited process for housing projects, and it increased housing capacity along key transit corridors and in zones that already had lots of buildable land and allowed for higher density. There were also adjusted parking requirements to help incentivize smaller units to be built by developers. So what did we not touch with the proposed land development code? Well, the city has really high standards for development. We think probably higher than a lot of other communities in Colorado. And those expectations didn't change with the proposed land development code. In fact, the majority of the text that was in this phase one that we did was actually carried forward from the existing code, because if it didn't deal directly with housing or the reorganization of the code, then it's still would have been in the land development code subject to future amendment. So there would have been no changes related to any of these things listed on your screen: historic preservation, natural resource protection, requirements for developers of projects to provide parks, open space and trails, landscaping and tree protection, water quality and stormwater management, requirements for neighborhood compatibility, utilities and infrastructure, traffic control, and no changes to the building and energy code. So one of the things that is an area of a lot of discussion with the community is about notification, and a lot of concern about how notification would have changed under the land development code. Under the code as it was proposed, housing projects would be subject to a different review process in a lot of zone districts. And that review process is called a basic development review. And right now, almost all housing projects end up going to a public hearing. And so this was part of the process change that was proposed to come more into line with best practices and also to streamline processes for being able to get housing to market. And so under a basic development review, there's still a full staff review, but there's not a neighborhood meeting or public hearing. The key there is that there is no changes to the public notification process. So even though the decision maker would switch from being, for example, Planning and Zoning Commission to a staff decision, there'd still be the yellow sign that gets posted on the property, mailings to property owners within 800 feet, a decision letter that then goes out to anybody that submitted comments and abutting property owners. And we would still include these projects in our email newsletters that go out about development projects. Some other big questions we had were about how exactly the code update would have supported affordable housing. In the proposed land development code, there were upgraded incentives expanded to all residential, commercial, and mixed-use zones. This really recognizes that there isn't one single policy that solves all the affordability problems. In the current code, affordable housing incentives are limited to only 2 of our zone districts, and they're not calibrated to align with the market. And so we heard from our affordable housing providers that the incentives were not actually accomplishing what they were intended to, which is to incentivize more affordable housing. So the land development code would have extended these incentives to every zone and then align them with market, including things like height and density bonuses, parking reductions, and expedited processing. But to balance that, right, there was also a really significant expansion on what we were going to consider affordable housing. in order to achieve these bonuses. Right now, the code requires a 20-year deed restriction on affordability, and that was proposed to go to 99 years, which is actually the longest period of time that we legally could require a deed restriction of affordable housing. In some of our lower density districts, which OTA is Old Town A and then residential low. So these are the kind of existing low density single family neighborhoods. The allowable uses would be expanded to include duplexes and one additional unit. It could go to a triplex only if that unit was deed restricted and affordable for 99 years. The incentives for larger projects would require that 10 to 20% of the development be built as affordable units, and that's depending on the income level that they're pegged to. And so implementing these changes when we mapped and modeled it all out would have increased the capacity for affordable units in the community to increase by nearly 200%. And so that's capacity. That doesn't mean for sure that all those units would be built, but it would open up the possibility for 200% more affordable housing units to be constructed. So one of the areas of really intensive conversation in the community, both as the code was adopted and ongoing right now, is what would have been allowed in those low density residential zones. So I referenced accessory dwelling units earlier. Those would have been permitted in all residential and mixed use zones. The other thing that would have been permitted in zones that previously only allowed detached single family homes as residential uses would have been the addition of duplexes. So you could build a duplex in those neighborhoods, or a triplex if you took advantage of that incentive and made it deed restricted affordable. There's also a new housing type out there called a cottage court, which puts smaller units on kind of larger pieces of land and then orients them kind of in a court formation. And so that's a new building type that that would be allowed within those kind of suburban zones. There's a greater number of housing types that would be allowed in the medium density zones to really kind of capture that missing middle housing type. And then we imposed a cap. We actually decreased the size of single family homes that would be allowed in our Old Town zone. So the Old Town area that has a lot of historic homes and is close to the downtown area. There's also more predictable building form and design standards for all housing types. And I'll show kind of an example of what that looks like. And just overall, all of these changes aimed at providing more housing choices in existing neighborhoods. I mentioned that basic development review process, and this is a really important one to have a good understanding of because residential projects in most zones under the Land Development Code would have gone through this basic development review. And it allows for approval or denial of a project by the director, so by staff. All the mailed notices and signpostings still go out before a decision in a BDR process. And there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. It's not just that an application comes in and we stamp it and it's approved. It usually goes through between 3 and 5 rounds of review with city staff. And that's 10 or more, frequently more departments that are conducting review and making sure that all code requirements are met. And they all have to be met before the project can be approved. And then anybody who is a party of record who received that notice, who made comments, if they didn't like the outcome, they'd be able to appeal that decision to the Planning and Zoning Commission. So I mentioned Old Town, which is really kind of the gem of Fort Collins. A lot of people are very invested in this beautiful part of town that we've got. And so we've had lots of questions about how the changes would have affected Old Town in particular. So the current land use code was calibrated decades ago, primarily to guide development of vacant parcels or greenfield development. And because of that, development in our older neighborhoods frequently experience a lot of challenges with results that are out of scale with existing building patterns. So in that historic core of the city, the Old Town area, there have been a lot of compatibility changes in recent decades. And so we knew that if we were going to be adding additional housing types, for example, duplexes or accessory dwelling units, that we would need to make sure that we were really focusing on creating a system that emphasizes compatibility. So in addition to adding those use types, expanding the affordable housing bonuses, we also reduced the minimum lot sizes for single unit dwellings so that they'd be more compatible with the older lots from the original 1929 zoning, because a lot of those lots are now essentially non-conforming. You couldn't do those today under the existing land use code. We also reduced the maximum floor area for those single unit dwellings to be more consistent district-wide, and really calibrated the design standards to make sure that homes would be compatible with the neighborhood. And I've got some images to illustrate what that looks like. So I'm going to walk through these next couple slides. This is an example of a block in Old Town, and it's a good representative sample there. The majority of houses in our Old Town are actually less than 1,500 square feet in size. There are some parts of Old Town where 2/3 of the houses are between 500 and 999 square feet. And so we'll focus over the next couple slides really on this middle lot there, which is an average lot size with an average sized house for this district, 8,896 square foot lot. And the house shown on there is 1,040 square feet. So under the existing land use code, this is what could happen to that lot. You could build a house depending on which kind of subzone in Old Town you're in, up to 2,800 square feet or even 3,200 square feet on that lot. And so for illustrative purposes, we put one that's kind of in between there, 2,800 square feet. So towards the lower end. If you're in a different zone district, you might even be able to go bigger. And redevelopment in Old Towns become larger in recent decades. And that's a major community concern we have a lot of documentation on. So in the current land use code, while lot size is calibrated to building size, you can end up with this a lot, where very large single family houses are being built in place of where smaller single family dwellings used to be. So under the new land development code, we've reverted back. We're showing now that existing housing unit staying there, the 1,000 square foot house. But in this image, we've added an accessory dwelling unit, the way that it would be required to be placed on the lot. You also notice that framing around the lot, that represents the building envelope. And you'll notice that it's changed and it's very well defined now. And houses would have to fit within this building envelope. So it limits building height and it maintains bulk requirements and then illustrates and defines them so that people can understand them. And then it limits the floor area of single unit homes as well as duplex homes, which I've got an illustration of in just a moment. And so in this case, you can see, from the street, the basic pattern of development remains consistent, even though an accessory dwelling unit has been added in the back. And on a lot this size, the maximum size on that accessory dwelling unit would be about 600 square feet. That unit size for the ADU is linked to the size of the original house. So here's another example on that same lot under what would have been in the land development code. So this shows where, okay, that older, smaller house was demolished and somebody wanted to add a new, bigger house along with an accessory dwelling unit. And this shows what that would look like. So you see that the house has to fit within these bulk standards and the new form-based standards that would have been implemented by the code. It also would have been restricted to a smaller size than that house that we saw on the first slide. In this case, it doesn't max out what the square footage is that they would be allowed on this lot. But you'll see that it also gets really close to filling up the building envelope by the time you add the accessory dwelling unit on there. And so they might be able to eke out a little bit of additional square footage, but it's still going to have to remain within that scale of the surrounding neighborhood because of the bulk requirements. And then to the big change, really. So duplexes would previously or under the existing land use code not be allowed in this zone. And this is an illustration showing what would happen if somebody wanted to build a duplex under what was proposed in the land development code. You see that that building envelope, the bulk requirements all remain the same, and they function to keep, even though it's a duplex building, keep it within the same scale of the existing pattern of development that's taken place in the neighborhood. And on top of that, there's a floor unit cap. And so this illustration shows somebody who's chosen to max out the floor area for each of their units, 1,500 square feet, and it really just kind of barely fits within that building envelope that's established. So what happened? I made reference to this referendum petition and the fact that the land development code was adopted but never went into effect. And that occurred because of something that's built into Fort Collins charter and is very typical for a lot of city charters, where electors have the power to be able to refer council ordinances to a vote by the voters. And so the mechanics of that are that within 10 days of council adopting an ordinance, someone has to submit documentations indicating that they want to pursue this process. They get language approved to go on a petition that they would take around, and then they have a 20-day window to collect signatures. While this was happening, a citizen group formed around the issue of stopping the land development code. They called themselves Preserve Fort Collins, and they're still a very active group in the community. They needed to get 4,228 signatures, and they received 6,447. Those were certified by the city clerk, so verifying that they were valid signatures. And when that happens, it requires council action at their next regular meeting. And council had really two options. They could refer it to the ballot, or they could choose to repeal the ordinance, repeal the land development code. And council chose to repeal the code. At the same time, they also asked staff to come back to them and return with a plan about how to re-engage with the community and develop a replacement. So council has indicated that they're still committed to doing these amendments, but in a different way and after an extended period of re-engagement with the community. So what were some of the things that we heard from people that were areas of concern as this petition was happening and really up to the present in this new process that we've launched? We heard a number of concerns about really legitimate and difficult policy issues. We heard concern about allowing these missing middle housing types in what were previously single family neighborhoods. A lot of people had very real concerns about allowing a duplex or a triplex to occur within their neighborhood when before it would have been a detached single family home. We heard a lot of concern that there were many people in the community who weren't aware of the changes, despite the engagement efforts and despite really thorough coverage in our newspaper of local circulation. That's something we've heard very, very often, is that people just didn't know that this was happening. We heard concerns about changes to those levels of review, that basic development review process, and a desire from a lot of people to keep public hearings for everything that goes to public hearing. We heard concerns about impacts to homeowners association communities. So if you live in an HOA that doesn't allow accessory dwelling units, a desire to keep it that way. In addition to those very legitimate policy concerns, we also heard a lot of incorrect information. So one of the really common refrains that we heard was that large apartment buildings would be allowed anywhere, including in single family neighborhoods, that a developer could, in your single family street, they could buy up houses and put a multi-story apartment building, that historic buildings had lost their protection, that Old Town could, basically be gutted without regard for historic preservation standards. And a really common refrain is that the first you'll hear about it is when the bulldozers show up in your neighborhood, which, as I mentioned, the public notification processes would have remained in place, even if a public hearing was not being held. And so, in addition to the legitimate policy concerns, some incorrect information, a lot of support also emerged for some of the changes that were being proposed, especially from nonprofit partners that have been really involved in the affordable housing space. And since that time, there's been a formation of a number of groups that are actually in support of a lot of the changes that were proposed in the Land Development Code. So what are we doing about this? Where are we going now? I mentioned council supports continuing the work to develop land use code changes and update the land use code. And so we went back last month in February to council and worked through with them a timeline to do approximately a 6-month outreach and engagement effort. The first stage begins with lots of listening and gathering input, and that's where we are right now. We heard very clearly during the adoption and then the repeal of the Land Development Code that people want opportunities to share their thoughts and concerns. And so this stage we're in right now is also just a really important time to share out information and ensure people know what's going on, and then collect feedback from the public as well. Based on what we learned during this first stage, and all the input that we've received really up to today, staff would then move into a second stage of identifying the specific areas to adjust and refine. So engagement opportunities would continue during this time. We'd focus on really the specific topics and on the options to consider for potential code adjustments. Then finally, we would move into a third stage where the drafting of new code language and alteration of the code language we already have would take place. That's also where we'd be doing additional modeling and analysis of possible code changes, and all of our legal review would take place. And then the final stage that would happen late summer, early fall would be to focus on the adoption process, to come back to City Council with a draft code, have a code out for public review, and get recommendations from boards and commissions, presenting that City Council with the draft code for adoption. And so wrapping up, some of the lessons that we've learned, and I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here because we're still very much, actively engaged in this process of listening and figuring out what the next steps of these land use code amendments are going to look like. But a few things that I do know is that there's probably not a silver bullet solution. This journey that we've gone through hasn't gone as smoothly as we would have hoped. To adopt a code and then have it repealed and then have a re-engagement process is a real challenge. However, I don't think that there would have been any way to avoid the dialogue that we're having right now about these really kind of divisive issues. Should we be allowing the missing middle housing in single family neighborhoods? What about accessory dwelling units? What about the affordable housing incentives? Like, that's just a conversation that needs to take place. It's been a major reinforcement for me on the importance of communication. I had that one slide that showed kind of the funnel where when you're developing that policy or plan level, you really have a lot of engagement from the community. And usually when you get to implementation, like, okay, now it's time to adopt the code language, that's really in the weeds, and people are typically not as interested in that, and you don't get as much engagement. But I certainly recognize that on hot button topics, especially in the environment we're in now in the post-COVID world, maybe that's just not the model that works anymore. Maybe it needs more. A lot of this work was taking place in the wake of COVID-19, and people's minds were on other things. And so that's certainly something that we need to continue to consider as we're in this next phase. And then a final takeaway for me is that I'm absolutely seeing that it is much harder to correct bad information after the fact than it is to get the correct information out there to begin with. And so it really just circles back to the importance of communication so that the community is engaged and knows and understands what's in the code, because it's a lot harder to come back after the fact and try to regain trust with the community when there's a feeling that that trust has been violated. So that wraps up my presentation. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and just am happy to take any questions that I'm able to respond to and would love engagement and discussion with the task force. So thanks very much for the opportunity to present.
Paul, there's several questions in the chat, so if the group permits, I'll run through those and more may be added. The first question was, where are ADUs currently allowed? And do we see many being built? And perhaps you could even add to that, why are they being built?
Yeah, this is really a deficiency in the code, that there's only a couple of zone districts that allow what we would call an accessory dwelling unit. And that term doesn't even exist anywhere in the existing land use code. And so there are a couple of zone districts that allow things that are called carriage houses that meet, very specific standards. But there's not a comprehensive view of where accessory dwelling units would go or what exactly constitutes an accessory dwelling unit. So this is, what was in the land development code, and any language that we bring forward is really going to kind of be creating a new set of standards around what those look like, because it's not something that's in the existing code that we can just pluck out and then expand to the rest of the city.
And could you expound a little bit for the benefit of the group on what you are hearing from citizens with respect to why they want accessory dwelling units, and what sort, there's always this worry about, will it be used for an Airbnb, and maybe talk a little bit about the controls the city has in place for that.
Sure. Yeah, we hear from folks regularly about wanting to do something like an accessory dwelling unit, and it's a whole spectrum of different inquiries. I'd say a really common one is that people want to be able to have the unit set up because maybe they have an aging family member, or maybe it's on the other end of the spectrum. They've got, younger children that, are now starting families of their own, but they're in a place where they don't need a unit that's, more than 600 to 1,000 square feet, and they want to be able to provide for that. That's not to say that everybody is taking that approach. Some people absolutely are thinking about it in terms of the economics of their property, and wow, what if I had a small unit in the back that I could rent out, and maybe a couple or a single professional could occupy that space, and it could help to offset the mortgage on the existing property. So I'd say that we get inquiries, that whole possible universe of different uses. The conversation around short-term rentals, things like Airbnb, is definitely a part of this process. As a part of what we brought forward in the land development code, we didn't have any changes or any expansion at all to where short-term rentals would be allowed. So the city's got an existing map that identifies the areas where short-term rentals are allowed today. And that went through a really extensive process years ago when short-term rentals had become a thing, and a set of regulations was developed for those. And so if you're within that area, then you're allowed to do short-term rentals. And if you're outside that area, then you're not. And that wouldn't have changed in what we proposed. We do recognize, though, that like, for example, if you were in an area that currently only allows a detached single family dwelling unit, and it also is an area that allows short-term rentals, there is the possibility that it might open up an opportunity for someone to do a short-term rental where they might not really previously. Like, so if they've got their existing single family home and they didn't want to rent that out as a short-term rental, even though they were allowed to, and now they're allowed to have an accessory dwelling unit, it's possible they might build an accessory dwelling unit and use it as a short-term rental, because doing short-term rentals was already allowed there. They just wouldn't have done it with their single family house. So it's a very complex kind of conversation. And I think that's one of the things that we'll be exploring more in the coming months is if we allow these new housing types, does that kind of necessitate a balancing out where there'd be even further restrictions on short-term rentals?
Thank you. Yeah, and I did want everyone to know there are limitations on short-term rentals in Fort Collins, but not everybody understands that. And so that also adds to confusion. Also, for the benefit of the group, just a reminder, we've got Colorado State University here in Fort Collins, and it's sizable. I think enrollment's probably approaching 30,000. So there's always a very high demand for rental units on the part of students. The next question is, would neighborhoods with HOAs or metro districts still be able to disallow ADUs even with the code changes? Or did the land development code override those?
Yeah, so we, over the 15 months that the code language was being put together, had a number of checkpoints back in with our city council on these kind of key policy issues. And one that we heard very clearly was a desire to make the code uniformly implemented across the city. And so, our policymakers and decision makers, from really pretty early on, set the vision that you wouldn't be able to say, okay, accessory dwelling units or duplexes are going to be allowed, but they're only going to be allowed in those places that don't have a homeowners association structure set up, because an HOA can just say, no, we're not going to do that. So it was really kind of an equity issue as they spoke to it. And so that is what we implemented in the code. In the land development code, there was specific language in there that said on those issues where HOA covenants would have prevented implementation of the housing goals that are in the land development code, the housing goals in the code rule. So you couldn't have an HOA that said, no, you can't do accessory dwelling units. I think there's, probably some ongoing conversation about whether that language even needs to explicitly be in the code. I think, without getting too down into the legal rabbit hole, it's quite possible that, adopting this ordinance after the adoption of HOA regulations could almost automatically supersede those kinds of requirements. So that absolutely was a consequence, and I'd say that it was pretty deliberate in the way that it was done in the draft land development code.
And if I could add a little color to that, there's even as Paul describes it, which is that the city ordinance would override HOA. There were views expressed. I think there was even one attorney who expressed a view that no, the city can't do that. That's illegal. So I think that gives you just another indicator of something that a city ordinance that should override HOA covenants, it still might be perceived that it can't and lead to controversy in and of itself. So very interesting. We have two questions. They're a little kind of sort of related, so I'll do them together. One is, what is the Fort Collins definition of affordable? And then second, does Fort Collins have area median income levels as affordability definitions in the code or the comp plan? And do you separate out rentals from for sale housing?
Yeah, I'll answer that to the best of my ability. I'm not the affordable housing expert, but I maybe know enough to be dangerous and answer the question. So yeah, we do have really clear definitions for what constitutes affordable housing, and there's been a lot of dialogue in the community because for those of us who deal with the issue a lot, it's we understand that like the specific word means a specific thing. And when we're talking about affordable housing, it's affordable to 80% of the AMI, the area median income, and lower. And the way that the incentives were set up in the draft land development code, there was sensitivity to the target AMI that they were being tied to. So if you had, even lower levels of affordability, 60% or 40%, then the incentives would be greater at those levels. And there is a distinction in the way that we have our definitions set up between ownership and rental. So there's, you know, a kind of set of criteria that are met to be able to be considered affordable as rental housing as well. You know, some of the other terms that get used a lot, like attainable housing or workforce housing. We've got looser definitions around those. You know, generally, like we consider for the purposes of our plans that attainable housing is that, you know, above 80% AMI up to say around 120% would be considered attainable, but there's also no incentives that are attached to that type of housing. So the only incentives were set up to directly target those families and those individuals that are coming in below the 80% AMI.
The next question is, do you know if Fort Collins is losing key workers because they cannot afford to live here? Examples are teachers, police, etc.
Yeah, that's anecdotally, I can say, yeah, that certainly appears to be the case. I don't know that I have solid data that I can point to that, you know, would give exact numbers. Although some of my colleagues, particularly like in our economic health office, may have some of that information. I know I've got my own personal story, right? Like we've all got our housing stories that my sister and my brother-in-law moved into the community over the last year. And one is they're both in education. One's an administrator. The other is former teacher who does curriculum development and teacher training now. And they chose not to move into Fort Collins, even though the reason they were moving to Northern Colorado was to be closer to us. But the economics didn't make sense for them. And, you know, these are, you know, highly educated people with really good paying jobs. And so folks who are not coming from a place of that kind of privilege are having an even harder time being in the community, for sure.
Yeah, and if I might also add a few thoughts on that, since I am a relatively recent transplant to Colorado, it is a big gulp, and not just Fort Collins, but anywhere to move here. And there are a lot of things that the state faces that certainly I didn't face in Missouri, water being one of those, and access to water. But having said that, here in Fort Collins, people obviously do want to live here. There's a lot of amenities, and in my opinion, the city is very well run and offers a lot of services. However, if you go a little farther out, there are other housing options, and they're not that far away. For someone who commuted 30 to 40 minutes a day for a job, you know, a 15-minute commute doesn't sound bad to me, but for some people that sounds terrible. So I think some of those you just have to kind of sort through. You know, is the issue living in Fort Collins proper, or is it the ability of Fort Collins to attract workers? And those might give you different answers. I'll throw in a very slight plug too, and let Tricia expound on it at the end. But the Larimer County League will be doing a webinar on affordable housing partnerships, and one of those will feature an initiative by Colorado State University on workforce housing. So that might be something you'd be interested in too. Okay, so let's move on to the next question, and that is, can the code also override PUD zoning? And I'm not sure I fully understand that question, but I'll throw it to you and maybe you can ask questions to get a little bit more.
Yeah. I'll try and give an answer from my understanding. You know, one of our co-project managers on the team is our development review manager and understands, like, we're getting into the technical nitty gritty here. So like I think that what the question is positing is like an existing planned unit development that was set up, and part of the basis of that PUD plan is that it only allows single family dwelling units. Yeah, my understanding is that we took that into account, and that the PUD would not be able to prohibit the new use types that would be allowed in the underlying zoning. So, you know, if it was a detached single family residential setup, that the duplexes and accessory dwelling units would have been allowed under the land development code and PUDs as well.
Okay, the next question is, how would compliance with deed restriction be monitored, particularly with rentals?
Yeah. So again, not an area that I have a lot of detailed understanding, but we've got within the city a group that is our social sustainability group, that is part of it's a separate service area from our sustainability services. And they're very actively involved in the monitoring of affordable housing. And in fact, our co-project manager on the development of these code amendments is from that service area. It's the city's housing manager, and she's co-led this work. And so I don't know the details of how that monitoring takes place, but I know that there is a system set up to have ongoing monitoring.
I think that's the end of the question. Oh, wait a minute, one more question. What do you think is the most effective way to engage the public? The $1 million question.
Yeah. And I think a regular reprise that we're using to a lot of questions is that there's not a single silver bullet. The engagement that we are putting into play right now is full spectrum, I'd call it, right? That going through the pandemic, we really learned a lot about electronic communication and virtual engagement as a tool to open up communication with people who otherwise wouldn't come out and engage. And so that is still really important to our engagement efforts, to make sure that we've got options available for people who aren't going to take a chunk of their evening out or their workday out to come to an in-person meeting and sit in a big room with a lot of other people. On the other hand, there are many in the community that now that things are back to normal as things can be, that is their preference to engage in person, and they're not interested in an online conversation like this one. And so as a part of our re-engagement, we've got a lot of in-person interaction planned as well. Something that City Council was really enthusiastic about, and I think we are too, is the idea of walking tours. So taking that a step further, not only an engagement that takes place in person, but actually going to representative neighborhoods like Zooey Zone District with people who that's the kind of neighborhood that they live in, and walking around a little bit and pointing to a block, like the illustrations that I shared in my presentation, but a real physical block, and talking about this is what somebody could do today under the existing code. And, this is what a duplex development would look like, and asking the questions like, how do you feel about that? What do you feel would be acceptable in your own neighborhood? And so I think that's an important component of what we're doing. And then just to get general awareness out, something that we did not do in that first run up, the initial 15 months of the Land Development Code, that we're about to launch right now, is a physical hard copy mailer to every resident and property owner in the city. And we haven't done that in the past. It's not kind of part of our usual arsenal, and there are good reasons for that. For one thing, the costs, we have population of about 170,000 people in Fort Collins, and to try and hit every household and property owner just with a single mailing is probably going to cost us $50,000 to $60,000 to do that. So when you're trying to be really effective with the public dollars, that's not a resource that you want to pull out without really thinking it through. But there's a lot of enthusiasm for that right now. We've heard it from the community that for folks who didn't get it in the newspaper, they didn't see it in any of the online newsletters, they didn't get it by word of mouth, to be able to get a piece of paper that says this is happening and here are the ways that you can plug in. is foundational to what we're doing next. So that's going to be going out really soon, and I think in a lot of ways is going to be the kickoff or the send off for this listening phase that we've had a soft launch now, and it's like the postcard going out is kind of the hard launch of that. So yeah, those are some of the ideas. The only other one that I'll mention is that because of this really, fascinating place that we are at right now, where these grassroots community groups have come up around, different issues, either, preservation and concern of stability in existing neighborhoods, or, yes, in my backyard, we want these things in our neighborhood. There are groups built up around that now. And so staff is making ourselves very available to those groups, and to do things like this, to come and, speak with the League of Women Voters and talk about what it is that we're doing. So we're not shying away from engagement with anybody, because we really just want to get good information out there, and especially in this initial phase, do the listening and find out what the different groups are telling us, so that we can take that to our policymakers, to our city council.
And again, if I might add a little bit, Fort Collins does have a lot of rental units. We're 60% rental. Is that right, Paul?
It's kind of the inverse of that. Rentals more like 45%. Yeah,
Right.
close
But
to half.
Yeah, about half. So, in some ways, the postcard mailing, you could say, well, that's going to renters, and do renters really care? But given what has been experienced, this ability to say everyone was informed kind of is important. And so even if it goes to a few people maybe many people who don't care as much as those that are actively engaged, it still is a mechanism to get that extra touch. I'd also say these two groups that formed, the nonprofit group in support of the Land Development Code, and then the neighborhood group in opposition to it, they are really, really well organized. And I was amazed at how fast each of them organized. They also provide a great communication vehicle too for the future. Okay, and then the question is, have you engaged professional messaging groups?
Okay, yeah, like individuals to go out and help to spread the message. I don't think we're quite at that step yet. We've got our entire staff team built up. We, as you can imagine, this takes quite a superstructure to make happen, especially on a tight time frame. So we've got a whole committee of folks that are focused on the outreach and engagement, and they're just at the point of gearing up right now. I don't know if they've got on their work plan the idea to use like professional message conveyors as a part of that or not.
Okay, I think that's the end of the questions. Maybe I'll pause, give everyone one last chance. Okay, we do have another one. Many renters who currently cannot afford to buy a single family home might be happy to see more middle housing types being proposed. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, that really ties in well, Julie, to what you were just saying about the importance of reaching the renter community. And I hope that as a part of this community dialogue we're having now, that one of the outcomes is that people who have different perspectives because of how they show up in life can understand better how people coming from different places in life have formed their perspectives, right? And so the perspective of somebody who owns their home, especially like I said, I've been in the community for 10 years. So I bought my home 10 years ago. Like the world looks very different than it did 10 years ago. And that'll shape a particular perspective, where your interests are, versus somebody, like in this example, somebody who is a renter, and maybe would love to be a homeowner and love to, be invested in the community in that way and take advantage of kind of the wealth building effects that homeownership can have, but they're not able to do it because there's not a product that meets their needs in the community at a price point that they can afford. And so, those are two valid perspectives, that my neighborhood is great and I want to keep it this way because this is what I bought into, and the perspective of somebody who is just trying to look for a better way to be able to live in the community. And that's really where the two perspectives come together on missing middle housing, right? That's an opportunity to step into ownership. You can, own part of a townhome or a duplex or, other type of structure and be building that ownership. And it might be at a price point that is, $50,000, $75,000, $100,000 less than if that was a separate detached unit. So I think that over the next 6 months, we're going to have a lot of great community conversation around that.
And I'll slip in one final question, if I might, and then we'll let you go. This listener today said that in the Section 42 world, they saw a decrease in the quality of construction in areas where the state allocator required extended LURAS, and a cautionary tale when you consider the revision at 99 years. And maybe you could talk just a little bit on any deed restrictions, sort of the process it still has to go through in Fort Collins, both for the permitting and inspection process.
Yeah, sure. And so regardless of the type of development, we still have our building codes in place and the normal process that developers have to go through to make sure they're complying with the building code, and then ongoing maintenance according to the International Property Maintenance Code. One parallel effort that I think is maybe related to to this question and concerns just about construction quality is that the city is really trying to take a comprehensive approach to housing, and in order to provide that stability and healthy housing, right? Those are the two prongs, that healthy and stable, that we know that we've got an existing inventory of rentals out there that are not healthy places for people to be living. And so a parallel effort is underway right now to implement a rental registration program that would include inspections by city to comply, to ensure compliance with the International Property Maintenance Code. And so council at a work session just a couple of weeks ago gave some direction around that to set up a registration program that in the next couple of months will be coming forward. And so that's going to be another backstop, another mechanism to help to make sure that the rental housing stock in particular that's out there over time is still providing a healthy place for people to be able to live.
And I will say we could do another webinar on that particular proposal before City Council and how it has ebbed and flowed based on the input of landlords. So nothing is easy, I guess, anywhere. So Paul, thank you so much. I'm sure everyone will agree with me in saying that your knowledge is incredible. Thank you. I'm so proud that we have you here in Fort Collins. I know that none of the discussions in the months ahead are going to necessarily be easy. I still am convinced we will come out at a good place, even though I think we do have a fairly sizable group of people, particularly some that have lived in Fort Collins a long time and don't want it to change. I do think we have people who do want to see change in Fort Collins, and we just have to give people a chance to have a voice and feel like they had a voice, and then make tough decisions and move forward. So thank you for everything you do. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Julie. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to come and speak with the group, and to all of you, thanks so much for the great questions. That was really thoughtful, impressive questions, and I hope I was able to do them justice. If not, feel free to reach out to me if you didn't get all the information or the answer you were looking for, and either me or my staff are happy to follow up and give you that information.
Thanks so much, Paul. It was great.
Yes, thank you very much
Thanks.
for the time to engage with us. It was very, very, very much appreciated.
Thank you.
We'll let you get on with your day. Thank you. All right, so there were a couple of other things we were going to do today, but I'm thinking we're almost at 1 o'clock, so we'll lay those over. But one of them was an update on the legislation from Kate, and there may be another way that we can pass that along to you, as well as Kathy. Do you want to chime in? I'm thinking she was going to share some information on a presentation we went to on Prop 123, and that may be able to be shared on our Housing Task Force webpage. So Kathy, you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, just what you said. We'd like to, I think, update our webpage and provide some information about Proposition 123. It's going to be an interesting time this summer, and the funding can be will be available as soon as July 1st. Local communities can, local governments can make their 3% commitment of affordable housing over each year over 3 years, starting May 1st. So it's happening quickly, and hopefully good information is getting out there to the local governments.
Great. So we'll work, Beth, with your office to get that information updated on our Housing Task Force page, if that's all right. Okay, and then just 2 other quick announcements to follow up with Paul's presentation. Just want to let you know that Julie with us that did the introduction has also written a very informative article that is also on our Housing Task Force webpage, as well as the legislative action page. And the title of her article is Lessening the Barriers to Housing Development, Lessons Learned from Fort Collins. So it just kind of follows up with Paul's presentation this morning. So if you're interested in reading that, go to our Housing Task webpage. And then the other is, Julie alluded to this, and information will also be on the state calendar as well as our local calendars. The Larimer County League is putting on a presentation April 20th, and it's all about partnerships and collaborative efforts that are going on in our communities to create more affordable housing. So we invite everyone to that. We'll have information on the speakers listed on the calendar, so you can get more information on that. So with that, we will let everyone go and hopefully see you at our April meeting. Check the calendar for our speaker for that meeting, because we're planning on bringing someone in to talk to us more about Prop 123. Okay, so anybody else have any closing comments or questions, announcements? Okay, we're good to go then. Thanks for coming today, and we'll be in touch. All right, bye-bye.
Thank you.
You bet.